I stood in the parking lot of the Riverside Motel at 3 in the morning, watching my breath form clouds in the February air. And I knew something was wrong before I even opened the door to room 109. The manager had called me because the guest, a Mr. Harold Chen, had missed his checkout time by 2 days and wasn't answering his phone or responding to knocks. I was a county sheriff's deputy, and these wellness checks were routine, usually ending with an embarrassed traveler who'd overslept or forgotten to settle their bill. But the smell hit me the moment the manager's master key turned in the lock. Not the overpowering stench of death I'd encountered twice before in my career, but something else, something sweet and chemical that made my eyes water. The room was dark, except for the blue glow of a laptop screen on the desk, and Mr. Chen was sitting in the chair facing it, perfectly still, his hands resting on the keyboard. I called his name, already reaching for my radio, but I stopped when I saw his eyes in the monitor's light. They were open, unblinking, and they were moving, tracking something on the screen that I couldn't see from my angle. His fingers twitched on the keys, and I heard the soft clicking of typing, but his face was gray, his lips were blue, and when I moved closer, I realized he wasn't breathing. I grabbed his shoulder to shake him, and his skin was cold and stiff, but his fingers kept typing, and his eyes kept moving, and I stumbled backward, knocking into the manager who'd been standing behind me. I told him to wait outside and called for backup and an ambulance, even though I knew it was far too late for Mr. Chen. While I waited, I forced myself to look at the laptop screen, and what I saw there made me wish I hadn't. It was a chat interface, something like the messaging apps I'd seen my teenage daughter use, but older looking, more basic, just green text on a black background. The messages were scrolling up rapidly, and they were all from Mr. Chen's account. But the words made no sense. They were fragments, repeated phrases, strings of numbers, and occasionally something coherent like "can't stop," or "it won't let me," or "how long has it been?" The responses from the other user, whose name was just a string of asterisks, were stranger still. Coordinates, instructions, questions about Mr. Chen's physical state, and twice, chillingly, the phrase, "maintain the connection." I reached for the laptop to close it, and the typing stopped immediately. Mr. Chen's hands fell from the keyboard and hung limp at his sides, and his head tilted forward onto his chest. And I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had been animating his body was gone. The coroner arrived an hour later and pronounced Mr. Chen dead at the scene, estimating he'd been deceased for at least 48 hours based on the rigor mortis and lividity. I told her about the typing, about the eyes moving, and she gave me the look I expected, sympathetic but skeptical. The look that said I was tired and had let the darkness of the situation play tricks on me. But I made her examine his hands, and she found that his fingers were worn down to the bone in places, the flesh simply gone, rubbed away by days of continuous typing. She had no explanation for that. We seized the laptop as evidence, and the IT specialist at the county office spent a week trying to access it before calling me with results that made my skin crawl. The chat program Mr. Chen had been using wasn't installed on the computer, had been running in the browser, accessing some kind of peer-to-peer network that the specialist couldn't trace or identify. More disturbing was that according to the laptop's logs, Mr. Chen had been typing continuously for 6 days and 17 hours before I found him. pausing only for microseconds between keystrokes, a physical impossibility for any living human being. The specialist recovered some of the chat logs, and reading them was like watching someone's mind disintegrate in real time. The early messages from 4 months earlier were normal inquiries about the chat service, which Mr. Chen had apparently found mentioned in some obscure corner of the internet dedicated to experimental communication technologies. The other user had been welcoming, explaining that this was a direct neural interface communication protocol that would allow for thought-to-text transmission with unprecedented speed and clarity. Mr. Chen, who, according to his employer, had been a software engineer specializing in human-computer interaction, was fascinated. The other user guided him through a setup process that involved downloading what it called optimization software and following a series of exercises to calibrate the interface. Within a week, Mr. Chen was reporting that he could type his thoughts almost as quickly as he could think them, and the other user praised his progress, encouraging him to practice more, to push the boundaries of the technology. But by the second month, the tone of Mr. Chen's messages had changed. He mentioned headaches, difficulty sleeping, and a compulsion to return to the chat even when he was trying to work or eat. The other user assured him this was normal, part of the integration process, and that the discomfort would pass once his neural pathways fully adapted. Mr. Chen tried to stop, according to several messages where he announced he was taking a break, but each time he returned within hours, apologizing, saying he couldn't focus on anything else, that his thoughts felt incomplete unless he was typing them into the chat. The final month of recovered logs was fragmentary and disturbing, filled with Mr. Chen's increasingly desperate reports that he couldn't stop typing, that his hands were moving on their own, that he could feel something else in his mind, something that wasn't him, guiding his fingers and reading his thoughts. The other user's responses became terser, less supportive, more clinical, asking detailed questions about his physical symptoms and mental state, treating him like a data point rather than a person. The last coherent message from Mr. Chen was sent the day he checked into the Riverside Motel. "I'm leaving everything behind. Going somewhere with no one I know. Maybe if I'm alone, it will stop. Maybe if there's nothing else in my life to think about, it will let me go." The other user's response was immediate. "Isolation will not terminate the connection. The protocol is complete. You are now a permanent node." After that, the messages from Mr. Chen's account were gibberish, though I noticed they contained embedded patterns, the same sequences of characters repeating at regular intervals, like some kind of code or data transmission. The IT specialist said it looked like Mr. Chen's account had been turned into a relay, mindlessly passing information to other nodes in the network, and that this might have continued even after his death, his nervous system firing randomly in the early stages of decay, enough to keep his fingers moving on the keys for those last few hours. We tried to track down the other user, but the peer-to-peer nature of the network made it impossible. We tried to find other victims, but if they existed, they'd left no trail that connected them to Mr. Chen or the chat service. We notified the FBI's cybercrime division, and they took our evidence and thanked us and never contacted us again. Mr. Chen's family claimed his body, and at the funeral, his sister told me he'd always been obsessed with pushing boundaries, with being the first to try new technologies, and that she'd warned him his curiosity would get him into trouble someday. I didn't tell her how right she'd been. The case was officially closed as death by natural causes. The autopsy found that Mr. Chen's heart had simply stopped, overwhelmed by exhaustion and dehydration and the physical trauma of typing non-stop for nearly a week. But I kept a copy of those chat logs, and I read them sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, trying to understand what happened to Harold Chen in that motel room, and whether he was alone in those final days or whether something else was there with him. Something that lived in the space between thought and action, between mind and machine, waiting for someone curious enough and foolish enough to open a door that should have stayed closed. And sometimes, when I'm typing on my own computer, I feel my fingers move just slightly faster than my thoughts, and I have to stop and close my eyes and remind myself that it's just my imagination, just the echo of a disturbing case that got under my skin. But then I wonder if that's what Harold Chen told himself too in the beginning, before it was too late to stop. I walked into my grandmother's house for the first time in 15 years, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous, and there was a smell I couldn't quite place, something between wet cardboard and copper pennies. My grandmother had died 3 weeks earlier, and I'd been tasked with clearing out her belongings before the estate sale. I'd avoided this place my entire adult life, ever since that summer when I was 12, but now I had no choice. The lawyer had been insistent, and I was the only living relative. The house stood at the end of a dead-end street in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by woods that seemed to lean inward, as if listening. As I stepped through the doorway, my phone lost signal completely, which wasn't surprising given the location, but still made my stomach tighten with unease. The living room looked exactly as I remembered it, the same floral wallpaper, now peeling at the seams, the same ancient television set, the same grandfather clock that had never kept proper time. But there was something new. Dozens of journals stacked on every available surface, their leather covers worn and cracked. I picked one up and opened it to a random page. My grandmother's handwriting, usually so neat and careful, was frantic here. The words pressed so hard into the paper that they'd torn through in places. "It comes through the mirror at 3:47 a.m. One entry read, "I've tried covering it, but it knows. It always knows." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, despite the stuffy warmth of the house. I told myself she'd been senile. That old age had taken her mind long before it took her body. But I couldn't shake the memory of that summer, the night I'd woken to find her standing at the foot of my bed, perfectly still, staring at something behind me with eyes full of terror. I'd turned to look, but she'd grabbed my shoulder with surprising strength and whispered, "Never look at it directly. Never acknowledge that you see it." The next morning, she'd acted as if nothing had happened, but I'd left 2 days later, making excuses to my parents, and I'd never come back. Now, standing in her living room with her frantic journals in my hands, I wondered if maybe she hadn't been senile at all. I spent the next few hours sorting through her things mechanically, trying not to think about the journals, trying not to notice how the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be, how the house settled with sounds that were almost but not quite like footsteps. Around 6 in the evening, I found the basement door. I'd forgotten about the basement entirely, had my mind deliberately erased it. The door was reinforced with multiple locks, all of them engaged, and someone had painted a symbol on it in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. My hands shook as I worked through the locks one by one, though some rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to leave this door closed, to get out of the house while I still could. But I had to know. I had to understand what had terrified my grandmother so badly that she'd filled dozens of journals with increasingly desperate observations and theories. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, and the smell, that copperpenny smell, grew stronger with each step down. The basement was larger than it should have been, extending far beyond what the house's footprint would allow, and the walls were covered in the same symbols that had been on the door, painted in layers upon layers, some fresh, some decades old. In the center of the room stood a mirror, easily 7 feet tall, its ornate frame carved with faces that seemed to shift when I looked at them from the corner of my eye. The mirror was covered with a heavy black cloth, but the cloth had been pulled partially aside, as if someone or something had started to remove it and then stopped. I knew with absolute certainty that I should not look into that mirror, that whatever my grandmother had been trying to contain down here was on the other side of that glass. But I found myself moving toward it anyway, my hand reaching out to pull the cloth away completely. That's when I heard it. A sound like breathing, but wrong somehow, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The temperature in the basement dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath misting in front of my face, and the lights began to flicker. In the stuttering illumination, I saw something moving in my peripheral vision, something that definitely wasn't my shadow, something that moved in ways that hurt to perceive, all wrong angles and impossible joints. I remembered my grandmother's warning from all those years ago: ever look at it directly. Never acknowledge that you see it. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the covered mirror, forced myself not to turn around even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. The breathing sound grew louder, closer, and I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck, felt the air stir as if something massive was leaning over me, studying me. My hand was still outstretched toward the cloth, trembling now, and in that moment I understood. My grandmother hadn't been trying to keep something from getting out. She'd been trying to keep something from getting in. The mirror wasn't a prison. It was a door, and something on the other side had been waiting patiently for decades for someone to open it all the way. I grabbed the cloth and yanked it back into place, securing it as best I could with shaking hands. And the presence behind me still refused to look at it, refused to acknowledge its existence, directly seemed to pause, as if considering. The breathing stopped. The temperature slowly began to rise. The lights stopped flickering, but I knew it was still there, still watching, still waiting. I backed away from the mirror, keeping my eyes forward, not allowing myself to turn around until I'd reached the stairs. As I climbed back up to the main floor, I heard something that might have been laughter, or might have been the house settling, or might have been something else entirely. I locked every single lock on the basement door, and then I went through the house, gathering all of my grandmother's journals. I read them through the night, barely blinking, and slowly a picture emerged of a woman who'd spent 50 years, keeping something contained, performing rituals, maintaining barriers, never sleeping past 3:30 a.m. because that was when it was strongest, when it tried hardest to push through. She'd bought the house because of the mirror, because someone had to watch it, someone had to maintain the wards, and she'd sacrificed her entire life to this task. And now she was dead, and the responsibility had fallen to me. As dawn broke, I understood that I had a choice. I could walk away, put the house on the market, let someone else move in, let them discover what was in the basement. Or I could stay. The journals were clear about what would happen if the mirror went unwatched for too long. The barriers would weaken, the cloth would fall away on its own, and the door would open. I thought about my grandmother, thought about the terror in her eyes that night when I was 12, thought about 50 years of lonely vigilance. I thought about all the people who might move into this house unsuspecting, unprepared. At 3:47 a.m. exactly, I was sitting in the living room when I heard the sound, that wrong breathing, coming from the basement despite all the locked doors. I checked my phone, which still had no signal, and I opened the first of many journals I would fill myself, and I began to write. I know now that I'll never leave this house, that I've inherited more than just property, that some doors, once discovered, must always be watched. And sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, I can feel it down there in the basement, patient and eternal, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for the cloth to slip, waiting for the day when there's no one left to stand guard. I wonder how long I'll last. I wonder if I'll make it 50 years, like my grandmother did. And I wonder who I'll leave this to when my time comes, and whether they'll be strong enough to resist looking directly at what moves in the shadows, whether they'll be able to maintain the vigil, or whether they'll be the one who finally lets it through. I died 3 times before I learned to stop trusting locked doors. The first time was in the basement of St. Catherine's Hospital, where I worked night shifts as a morgue attendant. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because Tuesdays were when they delivered the unclaimed bodies from the county. I was cataloging a Jane Doe when I noticed her fingernails were too clean. Everything else about her suggested weeks on the street, but her nails were pristine, recently manicured. Even I was still puzzling over this when I heard the freezer door close behind me, not slam close, like someone had pulled it shut with intent. The temperature gauge inside showed -4 degrees. I had maybe 40 minutes before hypothermia would kill me. My phone was in my locker. I pounded on the door until my hands bled, screaming until my throat gave out. But the basement was soundproofed, and my replacement wouldn't arrive until 6 a.m. That's when I noticed Jane Doe's drawer was open. I hadn't opened it. The body was sitting upright, head turned toward me, and those clean fingernails were now black with what looked like frostbite. Her eyes were open. I don't remember much after that, just the cold turning into a kind of warmth, and Jane Doe whispering something in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. She was telling me how she'd died in this very freezer, locked in by someone who didn't want her found, and how she'd been waiting for someone to share her fate. They found me at 6:15 a.m., core temperature at 79 degrees, clinically dead for at least 10 minutes. But here's what they didn't find: Jane Doe's body. Her drawer was empty, and there was no record of her ever being admitted. The second time was worse because I knew it was coming. After St. Catherine's, I quit the morgue and took a job as a night security guard at Riverside Apartments, one of those converted warehouse buildings downtown. It was easy work, mostly just walking the halls and checking doors. On my third week, I met Mrs. Chen in 4C. She was ancient, bent nearly double, and she baked cookies that tasted like my grandmother's kitchen. She told me she'd lived in the building since 1962, before it was apartments, when it was still a garment factory. She said the building remembered things, that walls absorbed what happened inside them. I thought she was just lonely, the way old people get. Then I started finding the doors. Every building has them, the doors that lead nowhere, bricked up renovations and forgotten storage spaces. But Riverside had one that bothered me. It was on the third floor, at the end of the east hallway, painted the same beige as the walls, easy to miss, except I kept seeing it open, just a crack, maybe an inch, and always at 3:17 a.m. I'd close it, make sure it latched, but the next night at 3:17 it would be open again. Finally, I asked Mrs. Chen about it. Her face went gray. She told me about the fire in 1962, how 14 women had died because the owner had locked the emergency exits to prevent stealing. They'd tried to break through that door, she said, the one at the end of the east hallway, clawing at it until their fingers broke. The building had been built over top their graves, she said, because it was cheaper than moving the bodies. That night, at 3:17, I heard screaming from the third floor. I took the stairs 2 at a time, and when I reached the east hallway, the door wasn't just open, it was gone. Where it had been was a hole, and beyond the hole was fire. Not modern fire, but the thick black smoke and orange flames of burning fabric and wood. I could see them, the women, pressing against a door that wouldn't open, their mouths open in screams I could now hear clearly. And then they saw me. They reached through the hole, their burned hands grabbing my jacket, my arms pulling me toward the flames. I fell backward, hit my head on the floor, and everything went dark. They found me at 4:30 a.m., lying in front of a completely intact wall. No door, no hole, just beige paint. I was in the hospital for 2 days with smoke inhalation, even though there had been no fire. The third time, I'd learned my lesson, or so I thought. I'd moved across the country, taken a job doing data entry, nothing that involved night shifts or old buildings or death. I lived in a brand new apartment complex, all glass and steel, built on what used to be farmland, safe. Except I kept dreaming about Jane Doe and the burning women. In the dreams, they were waiting for me, and they weren't angry anymore. They were patient. 3 months into my new life, I met Sarah at a coffee shop. She was perfect, funny and smart, and alive in a way that made me forget about cold freezers and burning hallways. We dated for 2 months before she invited me to her place. She lived in an older house on the edge of town, a Victorian that she was slowly renovating. The basement was her project, she said, stripping away decades of cheap paneling to reveal the original brick she wanted to show me. The stairs creaked as we descended, and I felt it immediately, that familiar cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The basement was exactly what she'd described, half-finished brick walls exposed. But in the corner, behind a sheet of plastic, was a door, an old door, wooden, with a heavy iron lock. Sarah said she'd found it during demolition, that it led to a root cellar. She hadn't opened it yet, because the lock was rusted shut. I told her we should leave it closed. She laughed, said I was being paranoid, and pulled out a crowbar. The lock broke on the third strike, and the door swung inward on hinges that shouldn't have moved so smoothly after a century. The smell hit us first, not decay, but something older, like earth that had never seen sun. Sarah shined her flashlight inside. The root cellar was small, maybe 6 feet square, with dirt walls and a ceiling so low I'd have to crouch. And in the center was a circle of stones, and inside the circle were bones. Small bones. Sarah backed away, pulling out her phone to call the police, but I couldn't move, because I recognized the arrangement of those bones, the pattern of the stones. I'd seen it before, in my dreams, the ones where Jane Doe and the burning women were waiting. This was where it had started, whatever it was that had been following me. The door slammed shut behind us, and the lock clicked back into place. Sarah screamed and threw herself against the door, but it didn't budge. I felt the cold creeping in, that familiar cold, and I knew this was the last time. The bones in the circle began to move, assembling themselves into something that had never been human. Sarah was still screaming when the thing touched her, and then she was silent, so silent that the silence itself was a kind of noise. I closed my eyes and waited for it to touch me, but it didn't. Instead, I heard a voice, Jane Doe's voice, telling me the same thing she'd told me in the freezer. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some locks are there for a reason. The building doesn't just remember, it hungers. They found us 3 days later when Sarah's sister came looking. The police broke down the basement door and found Sarah catatonic, staring at an empty root cellar. No bones, no circle of stones, just dirt and darkness. And me, sitting beside her, trying to explain what I'd seen. They didn't believe me, of course. They never do. Sarah recovered, mostly, though she doesn't remember what happened in that cellar. She moved away, last I heard, somewhere sunny and new. I stayed, because I finally understood. I didn't die those 3 times. I was chosen. And now I'm the one who waits by the doors, the ones that should stay locked, trying to warn people like I used to be. Sometimes they listen. Usually they don't. And when they open those doors anyway, when they cross thresholds that were meant to remain closed, I'm there in the cold and the dark and the silence, waiting to welcome them to whatever comes after. Because the building remembers, and it's always hungry.